Hello everybody, my name is Nixxiom, and today you are not only going to hear a story from me, but also Mr. Novel87 as well. That is right, you all requested it, and so I have obliged. Now, what we've done is we've taken turns writing paragraphs. We didn't discuss our plans with the other person, we didn't talk about our ideas, none of it. We just went off the previous paragraph written by the other person, and let me say, it got a little crazy. But that's alright. So with all that said, let's get started. Here you go. This is What If We Had Failed to Stop the Hour of Twilight. The heroes of Azeroth, Thrall and the Dragon aspects, would be gathered at the Maelstrom. Deathwing sundered form before them. His laughter would echo across the waves as his body would only deform further, spewing molten magma and blood into the churning waters. "You fools," he would shout, as his size would grow and his eyes would burst into living fire.
"Make peace with your end, for the hour of Twilight falls!"
The heroes of Azeroth could only look on in a horrible realization as from beneath the waves, beneath the rock, and imprisoned deep within Azeroth itself, the old gods would feed Deathwing greater power through the wound of the Maelstrom. Unlike the story we're familiar with, Deathwing would regain much of his power through his dark masters, and with his newly formed magma tentacles, as well as the liquid fire of his breath, he would tear apart and incinerate the last heroes of Azeroth, Thrall, as well as the remaining dragon aspects who had given up their power in an attempt to finally end the Destroyer. Deathwing would relish in his victory, but he would soon find the newfound power leaving him, the old gods draining his life, and slowly, the black dragon would sink into the waters, still filling the air with his laughter as the waves would wash his life away. When the news reached Stormwind and Orgrimmar of the hero's failure, the whole world seemed to go silent as the weight of the failure fell upon the leaders of both the Horde and the Alliance. The news of the hero's failure would first arrive to King Varian in Stormwind, and the message would also speak of a growing situation in southern Kalimdor. The forces of Cthulhu have overrun the desert, as well as Ungoro Crater and Tanaris, having driven off the Cenarian Circle, who were now fleeing back to Moonglade. The report would say that now faceless horrors were being seen in the waters of Thousand Needles, moving among the trees of Feralis, and even Horde soldiers in the Barrens would already be coming into conflict with the forces of Cthulhu. He would also be given reports of both Alliance and Horde ships being sunk by large tentacled beasts off the coast of Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms, stopping most shipping across the continents. From within his throne room, Varian would see the map of the world filling with the overwhelming forces of the old gods, leaving him praying to the light to show him a solution to stopping the Black Empire from rising fully once again. In his heart, however, a great doubt plagued him, and an inevitable end to all he held dear tore at the king's spirit.
With the Night Elves hastily retreating from the outpost and the old gods spreading a dark influence over the physical world, things are much better within the Emerald Dream. The seeds of the Emerald Nightmare, they make use of the opportunity, and Xavius the Nightmare Lord, he's quickly re-empowered. He uses connection to the world trees of Azeroth to spread the Nightmare's influence. From Teldrassil, Vordrassil and Shaladrassil, mist is starting to spread across the world, infusing its victims with the most horrible sights and nightmares. It claims their minds and turns them into minions of Xavius. Now with the Green Dragon aspect gone and the druids occupied, the Green Dragonflight has no other option but to abandon the dream entirely and hand it over to the enemy. The druids, who were trying to heal Northrend in the aftermath of the events on Mount Hyjal, they now find the powers turned against them, feeding the root of the corruption and empowering Xavius even further. They have no other option but to fall back and regroup at the Moonglade, the last bastion of nature still holding on against the darkness. Here we find Malfurion, taken over by despair, as his beloved Tyrande, she can no longer make contact with Elune, and he himself is forced to once again face off against his old enemy Xavius. This isn't the only mistake that has come to haunt him again. again, since the Worgen from Gilneas, they have lost all control. The corruption of the wild god Goldrin by the nightmare, and the darkness that has disconnected them from Alun's grace, it has eliminated the effects of the Worgen ritual. Their feral nature has taken hold once more, and any remnants of the humanity, that seems to be lost forever. By the time that the Night Elves have discovered this, the majority of the people living in Darnassus, they already been bitten and converted. Their former capital is now in the hands of the ferocious Worgen, led by none other than King Greymane.
No word had been heard from Thunderbluff for over a week, so Horde forces led by Garrosh Bane and even Vol'jin would march towards the crossroads, which would still remain safely under Horde control. Once there, the Horde would begin its march south, clashing with the occasional Twilight's Hammer outpost along the way. Upon reaching the entryway into Mulgore, however, they would find it under siege, large tentacles emerging from the soil, insectoid horrors from Silithus battering at the gates, and faceless shadows climbing the wooden walls to strike at the braves, desperately trying to defend their lands. A great battle would ensue between the Horde and the forces of the Old Gods. A battle that the Horde would actually win. They would drive off the enemy at the gates of Mulgore, but upon rising to the heights of the gate, a great horror would lay before the leaders of the Horde. Mulgore would be blackened and gray, the grasslands dead and dying, corrupted by the presence of the Old Gods, even if the territory had not yet been invaded. Bane especially would be affected, but he would not let himself be broken by the sight of his dying lands. Although silently, he and Vol'jin both would curse Garrosh all the more, as they both felt he should have acted more quickly. Perhaps then, the defenses of Mulgore could have been reinforced, and so many wouldn't have died in the slaughter that Garrosh boastfully called a great victory.
While Vol'jin and Bane are turning their anger on Garrosh, the Blood Elves and the Forsaken, they're desperately trying to come up with some sort of plan to reach the rest of the Horde forces. Being so far away from Orgrimmar when all of this took place, it has put them in a very bad position. The seas are under control of the Naga, with heavy storms churning the waves, and it's making it impossible to set sail. With its Dark Master resurfacing, the evil that has been locked away within Tyr's tomb, it has finally regained enough power and it started to awaken. The Twilight's Hammer cult, led by Twilight Deacon Farding, he's been working hard on uncovering the tomb and release Zakash the Corruptor. The ancient enemy of the elves, the trolls in the area, under the guidance of their dark and corrupted Loa, they've decided to throw in their fate with the Black Empire and stand together with the cultists. This meant that the elves needed reinforcements, and Sylvanas made contact with her younger sister, Little Moon, and she explained that they had no other choice but to stand side by side in this conflict. At first, Ronan does not believe that it's a very good idea to work with the Banshee Queen. The Develop Plague had had some devastating effects in the past, but for Risa, she's more level-headed. From above Dalaran, they have an advantage of looking down on the world below, and they can see that the hour is dire indeed, and old hatreds have to be cast to the side. The boiling tensions between Sylvanas and Lorthmar, they're also cast away, and they come up with a plan. By using the ancient knowledge of the Council of Tirisfal in combination with the energies from the Sunwell, they will be able to create a being, a guardian, but one even more powerful than any that had come before. It was difficult to choose who would pick up that role, since despite putting it all to their side, the old hatreds, they die very hard, and it was difficult to trust one another. In the end, they decided to go with one whose heart was pure and eyes were full of wonder. Perhaps she was young, but she was also remarkably intelligent and had a fierce curiosity for the world. Most of all, she was willing to give it her all if it meant the salvation of Azeroth. It was Kindy Sparkshine who was led near the pool of power, and she was granted all the power that they could muster. She would become their weapon in the war against the darkness, but in secret, Sylvanas already worked on a backup plan. She had seen the darkness of the abyss that was waiting for her, and she had no intention of ever going back. The Valkyr were all that kept that horrible future away, and in the back of her mind she could hear a voice whisper, a voice perhaps not her own, telling her that there was another way. She feared death. But what if she could become its master? She set on her journey to the top of the Frozen Throne, where she thought that her destiny was waiting, but in truth, the voice in her mind did only lead her to a quicker demise. Being closer to the Lich King and his kingdom of Serenite, the blood of the old god Yaxaron, his influence was able to regain control. The Lich King was a force for the Black Empire, and just as Sylvanas was ready to strike down Bolvar and claim the Helm of Domination, the Valkyr turned against her. From their eyes, she could see death gazing upon her, and she felt a fear that she had not experienced ever since escaping her eternal fate. She was once again alone, the walls of the afterlife torn away in an instant. She was once again alone, no backup against that eternal abyss, and the queen despaired.
And there were many reasons to despair as Sylvanas looked out across Northrend in those moments. Although Dalaran was mostly safe due to its floating above the icy north, the rest of the continent had already begun to be overrun. Yogg-Saron would awaken again within Ulduar, empowered by the recent events occurring across the world, and creatures of nightmare would be born from his thoughts to fill the hulls of the long-departed Titans. With none strong enough to keep the old god in check, his darkness would creep across Northrend, spreading whispers into its native populations, animals, and even into the forests themselves. Simple folk would be driven to madness, animals would die as if afflicted by an unknown disease, and forests like the Grizzly Hills would rot and decay away. Seeing this change of events, Tyrion Forgering along with the Argent Vanguard would do their best to contain this spreading blight, but as the lands decayed around them, poisoning their water supply and food, they were forced further and further back. And then, when Yogg-Saron's whispers began to fill their minds with doubt, that is when the first hordes of enemies began to attack the Defenders of Life. Faceless ones who had long slept within the depths of the world would unleash themselves upon the Vanguard, and after a month of fighting, Tyrion would give the order to retreat back to the Eastern Kingdoms, as there was nothing they could do to stop the growing shadow in the north without proper supplies. Only 2 of those ships made it to Stormwind Harbor.
Dalaran, packed with Blood Elves, High Elves, Forsaken, and members of the Kirin Tor, they have the advantage of being able to fly over the battlefield and see exactly what kind of destruction is creeping over the world. Despite the best efforts, they were unable to hold their ground, and they were forced to surrender Silvermoon to the cultists. Luckily enough, the powers of the Sunwell, they would not be at their disposal, as those had been taken in by young Kindi. This transformation, it did not come without complications. Don't forget that the Sunwell, it was originally created with waters taken from the original Well of Eternity, a bandage of sorts to keep the life fluids of the Titan Spirit from flooding out. The Titan Spirit that has now been fully consumed by the darkness, and Kindi Sparkshine, slowly but surely, she transformed from a kind-hearted optimistic spirit to a seclusive and grumpy gnome. Any attempts at convincing her to join them in their assault from above were often answered with pastries being thrown at the messenger. She wants nothing to do with the people around her, as the echoes of 2 voices are ringing in her head. One speaks of madness, of unspeakable acts of cruelty, which she could easily enough inflict on those around her. She had the power at her fingertips, and all she had to do was unleash it. The other voice was a small portion of what once had been good and pure inside the Titan, inside Envina, inside the gnome herself, that was trying to hold herself back. This was not the reason why she was granted these powers. Remember the good times you had with the people in Dalaran, the voices told her, and this inner conflict, it resulted in her doing nothing at all. While the force of Dalaran, they used everything at their disposal to try and claim a refuge somewhere down below. The miles traveled were bought with blood and sweat and lives, as massive tentacles, flying insects, and massive dragons, they hounded them night and day. Each time there was Ronin, pushing on the citizens of Dalaran to raise their eyes to the sky and observe. Today, they would avert the world's destruction and stand defiant against the Black Empire. Each and every day, he would stand there to lead the fight, never giving himself a moment to rest, and that would cost him dearly. During one battle, his focus was drawn to Varisa, who was shooting arrow after arrow, trying to keep these tentacles from drawing in their city. One slip of attention, and Corvin the Prime was able to pick him up and drag him away. Ronan screamed out for his beloved, who was forced to watch as the other Kluxi surrounded him. Zariel wasted no time and infused him with a paralyzing poison, preventing him from fighting back as they carried him lower and lower down below, where she would never see him again. Varisa did not give up so easily. It was time for the most powerful weapon to finally snap out of it and do something. She barged into Kindi's room, begged her, pleaded with her, cried and screamed, and did everything to make the gnome move, make her do something, then just sit there and let others die. Kindi could not hear her, was too far away, she was too busy trying to keep those struggling inside of her under control, and Varisa had enough. She picked up the tiny gnome and shook her around, slapped her across the cheek and tossed it against the wall. "They took my Ronin," she screamed at her. Kindy blinked twice and shock registered on her face. "Finally, a reaction," Verisa thought to herself. Perhaps not all is lost yet. But the gnome wasn't shocked to hear about Ronin. She was shocked to find only one voice still ringing so very clearly. "Look at what she dares to do to you. All they want you for is a weapon. All they want to is to use and abuse you. You are more powerful than any of them. You can show them that. You will never, ever have another elf look down at you." The shock in her eyes turned into a smile. "What are you laughing at? Go out there and do something!" "You are right," Kindy said. "It's about time that I should do something." The last thing heard from Dalaran was the sound of the city crashing into an area previously hidden by the mist, but now ruled by the malevolent powers of the old god Yasharaj.
The Horde forces would reinforce the territory, doing their best to hold back the forces of the old gods and protect what little lands the Horde still controlled. However, their efforts would prove in vain, for as the weeks would roll past, the soldiers would begin to lose morale. Twilight's hammer propaganda would be heard being whispered among the soldiers, and some men and women would just disappear into the night, never to be seen again. Even despite the warchief's cry of victory, the reality was that the fight was a doomed one in Kalimdor. The Horde would never be able to keep the ground they had defended. Vol'jin especially would speak out about this, telling Garrosh to abandon the west and reinforce Durotar and the Echo Isles instead, where their resources were more plentiful and where they could begin to work with the Alliance. Yet the Warchief would refuse. "We only go forward," he would say. Ultimately, however, even Garrosh's dream of pushing back the forces of the old gods was met with reality, as after encouraging the Horde to push further south to retake the last southern reaches of the Barrens, the Horde would be met with a terrible defeat. Surrounded and outnumbered, the Horde would be forced into a retreat back to the gates of Mulgore, and Vol'jin would openly accuse Garrosh of acting foolish and being blinded by glory and bloodlust. Bane, well, he kept his opinions to himself, or at least he tried to. Nobody knows what really happened a few days after that defeat, but Vol'jin was found dead by poison within his own tent, along with a number of his guard. The trolls blamed Garrosh. Garrosh blamed the Twilight's hammer. The orcs sided with their warchief, and the Tauren sided with the trolls. The Horde was divided more than ever, and now, seeing his old friend dead, 2 days later, Bane would lead his Tauren away from the Horde encampment in anger, away from the decaying land of Mulgore, away from their so-called murderous and insane warchief, and into the unknown, praying to the Earth Mother to find a place where they could survive the conflict, or at least die among those they considered honorable. Garrosh never heard from Bane or his Tauren again, but after their departure, the warchief recalled his men back to Orgrimmar, as the city, he felt, was their only refuge against the armies marching towards them.
Within Faramore, Jaina Proudmoore observed the events, and she quickly realized that if the Horde was unable to hold their ground, her little keep would have little chance. Like the Blood Elves and the Forsaken, they too found themselves trapped, as the ocean, it was no longer safe. Many nights were spent discussing what they were going to do. Teleporting all of them was beyond Jaina's capabilities, but staying here would mean certain doom. The brave men and women within Faramore, they told her to take their children as they would remain behind. There was no fear or anger on their faces, only pure determination that the last survivors of Lordaeron, that they would not surrender without a fight. Jaina promised that she would come back for them. They would not stand alone in this, and with a final glance at her beloved keep, she teleported all those that she could to the one place she imagined them to be safe, to Stormwind City. Varian was relieved to see that she was still alive. They'd been trying to figure out some sort of plan to fight back, but with the collapsed Deep Trem, the sea lane shut down, and the skies filled with Deathwing's creations, all of it seemed hopeless. As she looked at the soldiers trying to fight against the dragons, Jaina remembered something. During her time in Northrend, she was focused on bringing down the man that she had once loved, but she remembered reports about heroes venturing forth into the Nexus. There, they had fought against the former Blue Dragon aspect Malygos, and this was a place where the ley lines of Azeroth came together. And if she was able to tap into that, perhaps she'd be able to teleport the remaining people of Faramore to safety, as well as gain a powerful weapon against the darkness. Varian told her that it was far too dangerous, far too close to Dragonblight, but Jaina saw no other way. Despite already being very tired from the journey, she teleported herself as close to the Nexus as she could. The bitter cold wind struck her face, but she pushed on to her destination. Surprisingly, she saw no other blue dragons, no other creature in the area, and the reason for that soon became clear. From the top of the Nexus, a mighty roar challenged the tiny mortal that had dared to step into his domain. Chromatus, the one successful chromatic dragon, embodying all of the 5 dragonflights, it had been able to escape his arcane prison now that the aspects had fallen. Proudmoore looked up at the 5-headed beast, and a mad laughter echoed across the cold, desolate wastelands. So here it was, the same land that had claimed the beloved Arthas. Here it was where she would join him, where she would join her father, and all those brave citizens that chose to remain behind. Strangely enough, she felt no fear, no cold or hatred. She only felt righteous fury at a world that never seemed to be able to hold on to the light that they so desperately tried to achieve. Darkness always tried to swallow them, and Jaina Proudmoore, ruler of Faramore, would give it more than it could chew. "I'm coming, Arthas," she whispered as she, for one final time, gathered all her strength and took on Chromatus.
In the west, however, atop Teldrassil, the Night Elves would be desperately trying to survive the outbreak of the Worgen's wrath across their beloved tree. Malfurion, determined to set an example to the Druids, would talk of how nature would overcome the growing threats across the world, and Tyrande would be doing her best to inspire their people through their faith in Elune. However, not even Elune's light could fully comfort Tyrande the day that Malfurion vanished. Perhaps it was the spreading of the nightmare in the dream driving him mad, or perhaps it was an assassination of the Twilight's hammer. But one day, Tyrande returned home to the Temple of Elune to find her mate gone, never to be seen again, with his disappearance a mystery. Now, with the nightmare growing in strength, and as the Druids of Kalimdor felt their powers weakening further, what example Tyrande and Malfurion had set mattered little. Reluctantly, the Night Elves would at last decide to use the arcane to teleport themselves to Mount Hyjal, their last stronghold against the old gods. Perhaps letting mages into Darnassus wasn't such a bad idea after all, some would conclude. There, atop the mountain, they would prepare their defenses, rallying any who would answer the call to defend Kalimdor. And surprisingly now, a certain orc would respond. Garrosh, marching with a large host of Horde soldiers, would arrive at the entrance to the mountain passes, claiming that Orgrimmar had fallen and that him and the survivors had fled north. Now, Garrosh would tell the Night Elves that they had no choice but to ally themselves with the Alliance or face complete annihilation. As if the elves cared at first, however. Garrosh had been the one who had burned his way across Ashenvale. He had killed innocent druidic students in Stone Talon, and more. At first, him and his band of warriors would be kept off the mountain, but Tyrande, perhaps driven mad by her husband's loss, according to some, or perhaps being the only one to see reason, would allow Garrosh's people to settle on the mountain, adding their strength to the Night Elves. There wasn't even much of the Horde left, the Night Elves would realize as the troop would make its way up the mountain. The Horde had taken on the full force of the Old Gods' advance. To the Night Elves, the Horde taking refuge on Hyjal seemed to be more like a small warband rather than one of the most powerful factions on Azeroth. Tyrande and Garrosh wouldn't speak much, but in their brief conversations they would decide to focus their efforts on fortifying the defenses of the mountain, something that Garrosh was very keen on overseeing. Even Tyrande could see the war chief's broken pride when their first conversation concluded. Vol'jin was gone, Bane was gone, Thrall was gone, Sylvanas was a world away, and nearly all the Horde had been wiped out. If a song were written after all this was over, She knew that Garrosh would be remembered as the last war chief of the Horde, the one whose choices led his people to their doom.
As you can tell, things in Azeroth are not looking too great, and the places, the heroes that we know and love, they're losing more and more terrain to the Black Empire. Varian made a last-ditch effort to rally his people and hold their ground, but rumblings from the deep Northrend, it shattered any hope that they had left. Magni Bronzebeard, the King of Diamonds, had awoken, and he was talking for the spirit inside of Azeroth, or at least so he thought. In truth, his mind had been wrecked for years by whispers from the old gods, convincing him that his former friends and allies, that they were actually the enemy. He marched into the great forge of Idaforge, where a crowd quickly started to gather. His deep voice rumbled across the city, inviting all those brave and willing enough to stand at his side. Stand with him in the defense of Azeroth. Those that did, they were offered to undergo the same ritual as he had experienced. Gnomes and dwarves all were invited, but none in the crowd spoke out. All of them just stared at the leader, shocked to see him return. Moira, tears streaming down her face, her young child in her arms, was the first to snap out of it. Step by step, she moved closer to the man that she once called father, hoping to see some sign of recognition in his eyes. But there was nothing there. Nothing except two black pits staring back at her. The void had all but consumed Magni, and Moira could clearly see that this was not the man she had once known. The realization came far too late, as the earth beneath them began to rumble, and Silphid, Nerubius and Mentit rose up. Chaos erupted within Idaforge, with many trying to find some sort of escape. But once they heard the King of Diamonds' mad laughter that seemed to come from the very core of the world, they knew that there was only one way out of there. Moira refused to surrender to the darkness, and she tried to make her father shut up, tried to make that horrible laughter stop. She took one step towards Magni, and although she did accomplish in making him silent, the deathly silence was perhaps even worse. He grabbed her with a force she had never felt before, and he pushed her towards the edge of the Great Forge. Desperate, she tried to reach to him, reason with him. Please, father, don't do this. Please, just let me get my son to safety. Please, I beg of you. But her words had no effect, and the last thing anyone heard from Moira was the bone-chilling cry as she was thrown into the fiery pits of Idaforge. Those that followed her example and tried to stand up against Magni, they also followed her fate. And beaten, the remaining citizens, the heroes of old, gathered to hear the words spoken that would lead them into a brand new age, one ruled by the servants of the void. The rumblings behind Varian, the rumblings from the deep Northrend, they became louder and louder as the forces of Idaforge, they assaulted the last defenders of Stormwind.
It wouldn't take long before the forces of the old gods would be upon the defenders of Mount Hyjal, clashing against their forces in a glorious final battle. Spells would sing throughout the night, steel would clash, and in the end, the Night Elves and the remnants of the Horde would find themselves alive and victorious, having held their lines against the threat. Having been aided by the Ancients, the old gods would find that storming the mountain wouldn't be so easy, leading them to conclude that their best option would be to spread their corruption through the world itself, into the world tree's roots, and destroy the mountain from the inside out, rather than sending their forces to face the defenders head-on. It would take years, but for beings as ancient as the old gods, time was irrelevant. They were patient. Let them have their victory, they would say. They would think the mountain as their refuge, but in reality, it would be their grave. Thus ended the campaign in Kalimdor, and in the Eastern Kingdoms the situation would be similar. Stormwind had fallen. Ironforge, the northern half of the continent, was overrun, and what remnants of the Alliance remained had long fled into the mountains of Khazad-dûm and into the thick jungles of Stranglethorn to escape the growing power of the old gods. The Alliance was broken, the Horde was nearly wiped out, and at last the Black Empire began to build. Citadels of black stone would rise over the ruins of Stormwind, over the remnants of Lordaeron's capital city, and even the mountain of Ironforge would be transformed into a dark citadel, touched in snow. Over the years, both Kalimdor and the Eastern Kingdoms would be reshaped in the image of the old powers, and yet within the shadows of their growing empire, some still clinged to a desperate hope. And that, everybody, is our story. I hope you guys were able to follow it. Mr. Nobble87, I want to give him a huge shout out and a huge thanks for being a part of the project. And if you guys have any suggestions for another What If video, or another collab maybe, feel free to leave it in the comments below because I am reading. Anyway guys, thank you for watching / listening, and I will see you very soon.